a little about what you can do about that. Not only about monarchs, but all other moths and butterfly species that are native to Marin. And the presentation is by Christopher Cosma. Chris is a PhD candidate at Dr. Nicole Rafferty's lab in the Evolution, Ecology, and Organismal Biology Department at UC Riverside, which is where my daughter graduated from. His research focuses on how climate change is affecting moths and their interactions with native plants in California. Along the way, he just happened to have developed an app that uses some of the data from his database called ButterflyNet, which helps people find the best native host and nectar plants for butterflies and moths anywhere in California. I've tried it out for my garden, and happily, I have a good number of those that identified already growing in it. So it's a great place to start for plant lists if you want to create a pollinator garden, and Chris is going to talk about that. Before arriving at Riverside, Chris got a bachelor's in ecology and evolution from UC Santa Barbara, and he worked with the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute in Front Royal, Virginia, out in the Shenandoah Valley. So with pleasure, I turn this over to Chris.
Well, thank you so much, Dave, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks for having me here. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, just let me know if you can see and hear me all right. I'm going to assume that everyone can see and hear me. If you can't throughout this presentation, please just let me know. So yeah, my name's Chris Cosma, and this talk is about prioritizing California native plants for butterfly and moth conservation. So I'm going to go ahead and get right into it here. So like Dave said, a lot of my research focuses on how climate change is affecting moths and their interactions with plants. In particular, I focus on moth pollination. And throughout this talk today, I want to paint a picture of moths, not as these pests that we know from eating our clothes or invading our pantries or flying around our heads at night, but instead as critical components of our ecosystems, as important pollinators of our wild and agricultural plants, and as critical components of food webs as food sources for many different animals. But before I get into all of that, I do want to come to a species that I suspect everyone here is familiar with, which is the monarch butterfly. And as you all probably know, just last year, the migratory monarch butterfly was officially listed on the IUCN Red List as an endangered species. And the reason behind the decision to list the monarch butterfly is a long history of decline from around the 1980s. And most notably in 2020, the Western monarch Thanksgiving count, which tallies the population that overwinters here in California, recorded fewer than 2,000 individuals. So we can see these green bars representing the population through time. And this 2020 census actually represented an over 99% decline in this population since the 1980s. But like many charismatic species, the monarch is a poster child for a much larger problem. So taking a step back, in the US, around 48%, almost half of butterfly species assessed are in decline. That's over 200 species. And declines are most apparent in the Southwest and other parts of the West. And so we can see from this heat map here, the red areas are those areas with a faster rate of population decline in butterflies. You can see a lot of California is included in this area. Some work by Matt Forrester at the University of Nevada, Reno has found that butterfly abundance has declined by about 1.6% per year in the Western US over the last 4 decades. And really critically, they found that dozens of Western US species are even more at risk than the monarch butterfly, including extremely widespread species like the West Coast lady that's pictured here. So let's take a step back here. There are around 240 butterfly species in the state of California, and we know that their populations are declining. But like I said, I focus on moths in my research, and so I'm going to be talking a lot about moths today. And there are around 5,000 moth species in California. What about their populations? How are they doing? Well, the answer to that question is we don't really know, because unlike butterflies, no one's really studied their long-term population trends. But we do have data from other parts of the world, including in Great Britain, where they found a 33% decline in moth abundance since 1968. So just over the last 50 years or so, you can see this downward trend here. So if I had to guess, our Western US species, moth species are probably not doing so well either. So, Lepidoptera declining, why do we care about this? Why does it matter? Well, one of the reasons we care about declines in butterflies and moths is because Lepidoptera are the second most species-rich group of insects. There are over 14,000 Lepidoptera species in North America, and something that's often met with a lot of surprise is that 95% of the species in the order Lepidoptera are moths and not butterflies. So the vast majority of Lepidoptera diversity are moths. We can see this Lepidoptera phylogeny here, which is showing the evolutionary relatedness between the species and the order. We can see just this small highlighted section are our butterflies. Everything else in the order Lepidoptera are moths. So they're super diverse, and we also know that butterflies and moths are really critical components of our terrestrial food webs. As caterpillars, they're herbivores, taking in that plant energy. And as caterpillars and as adults, they serve as a really critical food source for birds and bats and a lot of different animals. And it turns out that in these two roles, as herbivores and as prey, Lepidoptera transfer more energy from plants to other animals than all other herbivores combined. And I really want to emphasize this point here, which is that herbivory can be a really good thing. We often think of herbivory as, something that we want to avoid in our garden and a sign that there's pests. But the truth is, herbivory is really essential in our natural ecosystems, and it fuels our terrestrial food webs. So let's take a look at the structure of our ecosystems here. At the bottom, we have the plants, our primary producers, taking in that energy from the sun. The only way that energy gets to the next trophic levels, our primary consumers and our secondary consumers, is through the action of herbivory. And so caterpillars and other insects and other groups of herbivores take in that plant energy and transfer it up to the higher trophic levels as they're in turn eaten by birds and bats and other secondary consumers. So when you see signs of herbivory, especially on your native plants, that could be a sign that you are supporting a local food web. Of course, there are pests out there, especially invasive species that also herbivorize our plants. So you want to be careful about that. But for a lot of the time, herbivory, a bit of herbivory in our gardens is actually a really good sign of a healthy food web. And again, butterflies and moths do this better than any group of organisms. Caterpillars can make up to 90% of the diet of some of our native songbirds, again, transferring that plant energy up the food chain. And some bats are actually moth specialists and almost exclusively eat moths in their diet. And so it's really no surprise, given these facts, that Lepidoptera declines have been linked to declines in our native songbirds and bats. So a study by Doug Tallamy found that insect-eating birds, so birds that predominantly rely on insects in their diet, have declined by 2.9 billion individuals over the last 50 years. In contrast, non-insect eating birds, so ones that eat grains and other sources of food, have actually increased by 26.2 million individuals. So this is pretty compelling evidence that the decline in insects, in particular butterflies and moths, is closely linked to declines, the declines that we're seeing in our native songbirds. All right, so they're really important in our terrestrial food webs, but another thing we know about Lepidoptera are that they're important pollinators. And butterflies get most of the credit here. So we all know that butterflies are out there flying around during the day, transferring pollen from flower to flower. But it turns out that moths are probably actually even better pollinators than butterflies, including other wild and agricultural plants. And so some recent studies have shown that moths help pollinate some of our food crops like avocados and berries and apples. And I can't find much support for this in the broader literature, but I suspect they also help pollinate our citrus trees because, as I'm going to show you in this video here, I recorded a moth in my very own backyard visiting my orange flowers. All right, so they clearly help pollinate some of our agricultural crops, but another thing we know in California is that moths are important pollinators of many of our wild plant species, and that includes the famous yucca moth interaction and hawk moth pollination of datura, evening primrose, and agave. And in some of my other research that I'm not going to talk as much about today, I go out into the habitats around me in Southern California, and I collect moths and I look at the pollen that they're carrying on their bodies. And in this research, I've actually found that around 60% of all moths in our ecosystems down here in Southern California are helping to transport pollen. And that includes not just these big charismatic moths like the white-lined sphinx that we see often at dusk and dawn visiting our flowers, but even boring little gray or brown moths that you may not even pay attention to. And this proboscis here containing all of these pollen grains came from this little moth right here. All right, so the moths and butterflies are really important parts of our ecosystems. And so we want to protect these services that they're providing. And doing that requires an understanding of why they have been so impacted by global change. And it turns out that that's a really difficult question to ask. David Wagner in 2021 described global threats to insects as death by 1,000 cuts. And this is essentially the idea that there are just so many threats being thrown at insects from all sides that it's often really hard to determine the leading cause behind any decline in a single species. And more often than not, it's probably a combination of many interacting factors. And that includes everything from habitat loss to introduced species, to pollution, including light pollution, which is really bad for nocturnal organisms like moths, and pesticides, the pesticides that we spray in our agricultural fields, but also the pesticides that we use at our homes. And then the myriad effects of climate change. And this can include heat waves and drought to increase forest fires and storms. These are all affecting Lepidoptera as well. So in conclusion here, butterflies and moths, like pretty much every group of insect right now, are being affected by all of these different stressors. But another thing that we know about Lepidoptera, thanks in part to the monarch butterfly, is that they rely very closely on native plant species. And the monarch butterfly is what we call a host plant specialist. And this means that its caterpillars can only develop on milkweed plants. And it turns out that specialist species are actually at greater risk of extinction under environmental change, in part because they are more easily decoupled from their resources. I'm going to go through what I mean by that here. So on the other side of the spectrum, let's say we have an ecological generalist, and a generalist is just a species that can rely on many different resources. So in the case of host plants for caterpillars, we're talking about maybe a dozen different host plants that this caterpillar can develop on. Now, the local extinction or loss of any one of these plants, which could be due to climate change or habitat loss, is not really going to greatly affect that generalist, because again, it has all of these other different interaction partners, these host plants that it can rely on. But when we look at our ecological specialists like the monarch butterfly, that same plant extinction or local extinction of that plant is going to greatly affect that ecological specialist, because it's the only plant species it can rely on. But the monarch butterfly is not alone in its host plant specialization. Actually, about 90% of plant-eating insects, not just butterflies and moths, but all plant-eating insects, are host plant specialists. And the key point here is that these these insects overwhelmingly are specializing on native plants. And I really like this definition of native by Rick Dark and Doug Talamy from the book The Living Landscape: a plant or animal that has evolved in a given place over a period of time sufficient to develop complex and essential relationships with the physical environment and other organisms in a given ecological community. And the reason I really like this definition is because it draws attention to the time scales that we're talking about, the amount of time that it takes these really fine-tuned interactions to develop between native plants and native insects. We're talking about millions of years of coevolution here. And so again, this puts the emphasis on why so many insects are host plant specialists. But one thing about Lepidoptera that I want to emphasize here that may put them doubly at risk is that they rely on native plant resources at each stage of their life cycle. And so we're going to review the Lepidoptera life cycle here to drive this point home. We're going to be showing pictures of the monarch milkweed relationship here, but remember, this applies to most butterfly and moth species. We have our eggs that are deposited on native host plants. Caterpillars, again, are often highly specialized on those native host plants, often only able to eat just one or a few different species. Even things like chrysalis and cocoon placement benefits from diverse native plant resources. And then we have the adult butterflies and moths, which drink flower nectar, and studies have shown that native plants are often more attractive and more nourishing to them. So they provide greater nutritional content as well. So just looking at this life cycle here, it becomes very clear that Lepidoptera need both their native host plants and their native nectar plants. Again, host plants are those plants eaten by the larval Lepidoptera, the caterpillars, and nectar plants are those plants that are visited and often pollinated by adult Lepidoptera. And so it's really no surprise here that Lepidoptera declines, including right here in California, are driven by the loss of native hosts and nectar plants due to things like habitat destruction and climate change and all of those other stressors that I talked about earlier. All right, so that's a lot of bad news. And for the second part of this talk, I want to get into the good news, which is what we can do about it. All right, so butterflies and moths are declining, but everyone has a role to play in the solution here. And we know that part of the solution, thanks to our friend the monarch butterfly, is planting native plants. Native plants support up to 15 times more native Lepidoptera species than introduced and ornamental plants, again, due to those co-evolved relationships that have taken millions of years to develop. And like I said, everyone has a role to play in this. Any yard or garden can be an important insect waste station. Studies have shown that milkweed gardens on private lands can contribute to effective monarch conservation. And I probably don't need to convince you of the benefits of planting native plants, especially to this audience here, but I do believe that we can improve the way we plant for native insect conservation. I'm going to go through what I mean by that. So the monarch butterfly is at risk, so we plant milkweed plants. But we can see that as the list of threatened or endangered Lepidoptera species grows ever larger, the list of native plants that we need to support them also grows. And so effective Lepidoptera conservation means moving from this restricted focus on individual species and interactions to considering entire communities of threatened Lepidoptera species, because entire communities of Lepidoptera are threatened. And one of the ways that we can do this is by using an ecological network approach. And ecological networks just describe the interactions between entire communities of plants and the insects that rely on them. And through analyzing these sorts of networks here, we can help identify important species and also those that are more vulnerable. And this can help us in prioritizing species and conservation efforts, including at-home garden efforts. And so again, this may include our specialist insects like the monarch butterfly, which relies on very few plant species, but it could also mean generalist plants that support many different insects throughout the community. And so what I've done in this project is I've taken a guide called California Plants as Resources for Lepidoptera by Jeffrey Caldwell. And this is a statewide interaction data set detailing the interactions between butterflies and moths and their native California hosts and nectar plants. And in this data set, we have around 2,000 Lepidoptera species, around 2,000 native plant species, and 14,000 unique interactions recorded. And what I've done is I've adapted this data set into a web application called the Butterfly Net. And this app is intended to help people find the best native hosts and nectar plants for butterflies and moths anywhere in California. So I'm going to go through how I built this app and why we need it. And also I'm going to explain how to use it for the rest of this talk. So jumping right into what the app looks like in case you want to play around with it. Well, first of all, I should have mentioned that you can access it on a smartphone, but it does work a whole lot better on a computer. So I highly recommend visiting this web address here, and I'll also post it later for you to look at. So the first thing you're going to do on this app is either enter your California address in the search bar or click on it on the map. And then after you do that, you're going to hit the Find Plants button. It's going to take a little bit to load, and then once it does, it's going to tell you which level 3 and level 4 ecoregion you're in. I'm going to tell you what that means later on. It's also going to give you the option to select a desired habitat type. And so this is going to be a list of at least 5 natural habitat types that occur around you in your area that you may want to emulate in whatever kind of habitat project you're working on, whether it's a native garden or a habitat restoration. You're also going to have the option to focus on host plants, nectar plants, or both, and butterflies, moths, or both. And so it's going to show you a list here. By default, it begins with the first 10 species, but these are going to be ranked from best to least attractive for Lepidoptera in your area, the list of priority plant species. And so I'm going to go through what these the blue highlights mean later on as well. But this is going to be a list of some of the best plants in your area for butterflies and moths. And if you scroll down, it's also going to show you the local interaction networks. So they're going to look like this, but really what these are showing you are your caterpillar host plant network, as well as your adult nectar plant network for your local area. All right, so we'll go through how to use the app a little bit more later on. First, I'm going to go through 3 important considerations that I've arrived at through analyzing this data in order to better protect entire communities of threatened butterflies and moths in California. Number 1, we have to plant both native hosts and nectar plants. Number 2, we have to prioritize the most important plant species. And number 3, we have to consider geographic variation in species and interactions. So beginning with point number 1 here, the importance of planting both native host and nectar plants. We see a lot of emphasis on things like pollinator gardens, which are often focused on providing those showy floral resources for adult butterflies and bees and other adult pollinators. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, as in the monarch conservation effort, we have a focus on just providing the larval host plants, milkweeds for monarchs. But as I showed you earlier, Lepidoptera rely on native plant resources at each stage of their life cycle. And really interestingly, there's been some research showing that the loss of monarch nectar plants could actually contribute more to their decline than the loss of milkweed. So really what this is telling us is conservation efforts have to consider resource dependencies at each life stage. And so we can do this with this data set by looking at our caterpillar host plant networks and our adult nectar plant networks. And what I found is that caterpillars are more specialized than adults. In the caterpillar host plant networks, on average, there's 3.6 host plants per species. Whereas in the nectar plant network, there's an average of 14.7 nectar plants per species. This also means that caterpillars are likely more sensitive to plant extinctions than adults. And so what we've done here is run a computer simulation where we take out plants from that network and we analyze which butterflies and moths are likely to be lost from the network as a result. And we found that in the caterpillar host plant network, it only takes on average 1.4 plant extinctions to drive one insect extinct. Whereas in the nectar plant network, it takes on average 6.25 plant extinctions to drive one insect extinct from the network. So what we're seeing here again is that the caterpillars are much more sensitive to simulated plant extinctions than the adult butterflies and moths. And again, this is emphasizing the fact that a lot of caterpillars are host plant specialists, and it's not just the monarch. I found that 43% of Lepidoptera species in California have just one host plant species, and a full 73% have just 3 or fewer host plant species. So again, this is telling us that caterpillars are very picky eaters, and that means we have to be picky in choosing which host plants to provide them. But really importantly here, I found that Lepidoptera use discrete host and nectar plants. And so what I'm showing you here is that as caterpillars, the butterflies and moths are going to be using a different subset of the plant community than they're using as adults. And this was statistically significant throughout all of California. And so what this is telling us is we could plant all of the best host plants in our local habitats here while not really providing many good nectar plants and vice versa. And so while we see an emphasis on either pollinator gardens or larval host plant gardens, what we really need for effective Lepidoptera conservation is planting both those native hosts and nectar plants, like this sign from the UCR Botanic Gardens emphasizes. And so it comes down to the simple idea that without the caterpillar, you don't get the butterfly or the moth, and vice versa. Without supporting our adult butterflies and moths with their host plants, we're not going to get future generations of caterpillars. All right, so concluding this section, we found that while the caterpillar stage is more specialized and more vulnerable to plant species loss, Lepidoptera use discrete hosts and nectar plants, and this emphasizes the importance of planting both to support the entire Lepidoptera life cycle. Moving on to point number 2, why we have to prioritize the most important plant species. California is a biodiversity hotspot. In the California floristic province, there are over 6,500 native or endemic plant species. And in this data set, we have around 2,000 included as known Lepidoptera hosts and nectar plants. So I really doubt that most people are going to be planting 2,000 plant species in their yards. So if our goal is to support butterflies and moths, we still have a lot of prioritizing to do here. And the way that I've approached prioritizing nectar and host plants for Lepidoptera is coming back to a really old but important concept in ecology called the keystone species concept. And keystone species are just those species that are disproportionately important to the rest of the system, like the keystone in a Roman arch, which prevents the rest of it from collapsing. And I found that in California, a few keystone plant species support the majority of Lepidoptera species. What I mean by that here is that out of the 2,000 plants in this data set, just 32% of the host plants support a full 90% of Lepidoptera species in California. And even more strikingly, just 9% of our nectar plant species support that full 90% of Lepidoptera species. So this small percent of hosts and nectar plants are our keystone plant species. These are the ones doing the most work out there and the ones that we should be prioritizing. But we can take this idea even a step further with ecological networks by analyzing what's called network modularity. And this is the tendency of groups of species within networks to form compartments of more closely interacting species. So in this visual to the right, let's say the entire thing here is our plant herbivore network or plant pollinator network. And the shaded regions here are those modules where the species in that module are interacting more closely with one another. And two important roles have been established within these modules. We have our hubs, which are just species that are highly connected within their own modules, like the species in the red. And then we have our module connectors, and those are species that help connect different modules and help maintain cohesion of the entire network. And really importantly, studies have shown that the loss of these module hubs and connectors leads to cascading extinctions across networks. And so in other words, when we lose these hubs and connectors, these keystone species, many more species will be lost from the network as a result. So these are the species we want to protect. These are the ones that are maintaining stability throughout the community. And so when you see this priority plant species list, the way that these plants are ranked is using that modularity analysis, analyzing these local interaction networks to pull out those keystone species that are most important for maintaining stability of your local interaction networks. And really importantly, I want to point out that this ranking method, which is a community level ranking method, does not necessarily sacrifice our rare or threatened species. So again, I'm going to use the monarch as an example here. When you see the blue highlight, what that means is that that plant species supports a federally or state listed threatened or endangered Lepidoptera species, and there are about 20 in California. Most of them are in the Bay Area. And so what you'll often see in these lists are, well, first of all, you can see how many blue highlights these are, but you'll often see that milkweed species are often included pretty high up on these lists. And that's because although we know milkweed as the monarch plant, Asclepius species in California actually hosts 4 different Lepidoptera species, including one of my favorites, the Cleo tiger moth, and they provide nectar for 104 Lepidoptera species. And so in particular, they're really, really critical nectar plants for a lot of different species, not just the monarch butterfly. And so again, even though we know milkweed as the monarch plant, we can see that this plant is a keystone species supporting an entire community of butterflies and moths. All right, so concluding this section here, we found that few keystone plant species support the majority of Lepidoptera species. We also found that this community level plant ranking does not necessarily sacrifice our rare or threatened species like the monarch butterfly. All right, moving on to my last point here, the importance of considering geographic variation in species and interactions. And this is a really critical one. So California is a huge and very diverse state. We have a diversity of species and habitat types, and even a diversity of different interactions. And all of these can vary with things like latitude and elevation and distance from coast. So again, I'm going to come back to the monarch to emphasize this point. There are actually around 15 different native milkweed species in California, all inhabiting a slightly different range. You can see those ranges by the different colors on this map here. And we know that it's actually really important to plant local milkweed varieties, so just species that are native to your local region. And the reason is because if you don't do that, you can actually confuse monarch migration patterns. So it's really important to use your local milkweed varieties. But we can actually extend this same idea to the community level. And what I've done is I've taken California's ecoregions, and ecoregions are just areas of similar climate conditions and also similar types of ecosystems. And so here, the different colors on this map are all our different ecoregions. Wherever you live in one of these ecoregions, there's going to be a variety of different natural habitat types that occur around you. I gave this talk at the CMPS conference, so we're looking at San Jose right now. And in San Jose, there's everything from mixed chaparral to different types of native grasslands. And so across this habitat matrix, there's going to be Lepidoptera species and plant species that occur. And some of these species are going to be restricted to specific habitat types. So maybe we have some habitat specialists here. Some of them are going to occur pretty much across all different types of habitats. So what I've done is I've filtered these plant and Lepidoptera occurrences by the habitats and the ecoregions to extract just the local interaction network for each different type of habitat in every single ecoregion in California. And so again, here we're showing just the interaction network containing the species of plants and Lepidoptera that occur in the annual grassland habitat in the Central California foothills and coastal mountains, just as an example. And so again, just like we know that it's important to plant local milkweed species, it's also important to consider which species of butterflies and moths are interacting with which plants around you in the specific ecoregion and habitat. And what my app does is it extracts those local interaction networks. It performs that modularity analysis on that local network to rank these plants based on how important they are in that specific location. And by doing this, I've actually found that the identity of those keystone plant species varies significantly between these California ecoregions and habitat types. So we can't be using necessarily the same plants in Southern California that we do in Northern California. And we have to consider location here. And this makes a lot of sense when we zoom in on how individual species roles vary across the landscape. So on the y-axis here, I'm plotting, a metric that I call plant importance. And this is on a scale of 0 to 1, and it's calculated from that modularity analysis. So basically, closer to 1 is more important as a host and nectar plant for Lepidoptera. On the x-axis, we have the ecoregions, all of the main ecoregions types, roughly from north to south. So I'm just going to put individual plant species up here, starting with yarrow, Achillea millefolium. So one thing we can see here is that this plant, yarrow, does vary in how important it is for Lepidoptera across its range. You can see that it shows up in every single ecoregion, but it's more important in this middle part of its range, kind of around the central basin. Now, when we plot more plants up here, this time narrow leaf milkweed, we can see two things. Number one, a slightly different pattern and how it varies in importance across the landscape. Narrow leaf milkweed actually becoming slightly more important in the southern part of its range. But we can also see, as we put more plants up here, this time chamise, that these plants vary in relation to one another and how important they are for Lepidoptera. And so finally ending with California mugwort here. You know, California mugwort's a great plant for other reasons, but it's really not the best host or nectar plant for Lepidoptera. Whereas at the top here in green, our yarrow, we can see is important for Lepidoptera pretty much across its entire range. All right, so concluding this section, we found that the identity of keystone plant species for Lepidoptera varies significantly between California ecoregions and habitat types. And we also found that the importance of individual plant species for Lepidoptera varies significantly throughout the landscape. And again, this is emphasizing the importance of considering that geographic variation in species and interactions. All right, so after all this, you may still be asking yourself, so which species should I plant? Well, the most direct answer to that is use the app. So this app is specifically designed, as I've said, to find the local interaction network at your location comprised just of those butterflies and moths interacting with the plants that occur around you. And so again, it's going to give you all these options. It's going to tell you which ecoregions you are in. It's going to give you the options to select a variety of different natural habitat types that occur around you. So maybe you want to plant an annual grassland type habitat in your yard. It's going to show you which plant species are the best for Lepidoptera in that specific habitat type. And then again, you can filter for a variety of options down here as well. All right, so again, just to emphasize the importance of considering location, I'm going to go through where you are, probably most of you are in Marin County, I'm going to assume. So let's just zoom in on Marin County. And in Marin, we have basically two what are called level 3 ecoregions. So these are just our broader designations here. We have the Coast Range, and we have our Central California foothills and coastal mountains. Now, within those, we have even more level 4 ecoregions. So we have the Franciscan Redwood Forest, Point Reyes, Bodega Coastal Hills, the Marin Hills, and the Bay Flats, all occurring within Marin County here. Now, going even deeper, and again, this is to emphasize why we have to consider location. There are 18 different natural habitat types that occur in Marin County. Everything from different types of wetlands to grasslands, coniferous forests, meadows, all sorts of different types occurring in different locations scattered throughout this county here, you can see in this map. But there are some plants that are pretty good in a lot of different places. So what I've done for you here is I've analyzed this data across Marin County, and I've come up with some lists of plants that are likely pretty good contenders. But keep in mind that this is a summary of data across a pretty large geographic area. So some of these plant species are going to be maybe restricted to a certain habitat type. So really, to find the ones that are best for your area, use the app. But here we go for just basically to look at some plants interacting with Lepidoptera. So here are some of the best butterfly nectar plants in Marin County. We have California buckeye. Great plant for butterflies and moths. Here we have a monarch nectaring on buckeye. We have common yarrow. Yarrow is going to always be at the top of these lists. It's probably, I would say, the best butterfly plant you can plant. And here we have the mission blue butterfly, which is an endangered butterfly species in Marin County, nectaring on common yarrow. And I believe someone here may know better than me, but I believe the mission blue is down in the most southern part of Marin County. So maybe if you live around there, you can provide some resources for the mission blue. Then we have Toyon, again, a really good butterfly plant here. We have the monarch nectaring on it and tons of different species using Toyon, including the western tiger swallowtail. I'm only going to go through the first a couple of examples on each of these lists here. Let's switch over to butterfly host plants in Marin County. We have cream bush, which I've heard by other names as well, but Holodiscus discolor, which serves as a host for the Lorcan's admiral, among other types of butterflies. So here's that caterpillar here. Coffeeberry, which is a host plant for the pale swallowtail and many others. We can see the pale swallowtail caterpillar here. And then miniature lupine, which again, we see our mission blue, this time our caterpillar, using the miniature lupine and other species of lupine in Marin County as a host plant. All right, moving on to moths, my particular passion. Let's talk about moth nectar plants. So we have blue dicks, which I believe is Dipterostemen now, but that name seems to be changing a lot. So I couldn't find a picture of a moth visiting blue dicks, and that's often the case because moths are usually active at night when we're not taking pictures, but this is what I think it would look like of a white-lined sphinx nectaring on blue dicks. And white-lined sphinx, again, are very common, very widespread moth species in California. That's a really important pollinator. We have California yerba santa, which is serving as a nectar plant here for the, this is a pyralid moth, I believe, just a small little moth. Using this as a nectar source. So again, it's not just our big, charismatic, pretty looking butterflies and moths that we need to be supporting. It's these boring little gray, dull moths that you probably don't even pay attention to. Coyote mint. Coyote mint serves as a nectar plant for the California clearwing moth, which is a really cool day-flying moth species with clear, translucent wings. All right, let's move on to finally moth host plants in Marin County. We have red alder, which serves as a host plant for hundreds of different butterfly and moth species, including many different types of tussock moths, which can cause outbreaks. We have Pacific madrone, which is actually a host plant for the Ceanothus silk moth. So it's not just Ceanothus, it's madrone and Douglas fir, and a lot of different plants actually serve as a host plant for the Ceanothus silk moth. And then we have Douglas fir. You'll notice that a lot of the plants on our host plant lists are going to be the tree species. So trees are more commonly than herbs or shrubs serve as host plants, especially for moths. So Douglas fir in our data is hosting dozens of different moth species and a couple of butterfly species in California. A lot of these are pest species that actually lead to outbreaks on Douglas fir that can defoliate the trees, but a lot of them are these little guys like this geometrid moth, which has really good camouflage. You can barely see it here. So a lot of these are just going unnoticed and don't really cause a lot of damage. All right, so concluding my talk here, I do want to come back to our friend, the monarch butterfly. And I know a lot of you are aware of this data set now, but like I said at the beginning of this talk, in 2020, the Western population suffered an over 99% decline. Now, the good news here is that in 2021, they recorded an over 100-fold increase in the Western monarch population, thanks in part to milkweed planting efforts. And in 2022, just this past year, the Thanksgiving count recorded another increase, 335,000, over 335,000 individual monarchs. And so this is a really promising upward trend, again, thanks in part to milkweed planting efforts. So this is showing you that these sorts of efforts really can make a difference. Planting those host plants and nectar plants for Lepidoptera species really can do a lot to help them. But I hope I showed you here today that it's not just the monarch that's at risk. And with apps like mine, we can all start finding the best native host and nectar plants for butterflies and moths to support entire communities in California. Thank you. And before I take questions, I do just want to mention that this application, this data set is a work in progress. There are errors in the data set. So I will ask you that if you're using the app, playing around with it, finding those plant species, if you see a plant species, for example, that does not belong in that area, please send me an email sending the details of where you found it and what habitat type, etc., so that I can track down and correct those errors. There's also links on the app website itself that you can do that on. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone that's helped me so much on this project, including the members of my lab, my PI, Nicole Rafferty, the data, Jeffrey Caldwell did us all a great service, spending years of his life compiling this data set, and it's really, really an invaluable resource. I've been working with folks from CMPS and CalScape to integrate this sort of system into their online tools. So you can look for updates on that coming up. And then, of course, all of the undergraduates that have helped me along the way as well. Thank you, everyone.
Chris, thank you so much, both for a wonderful presentation and also for your ability to quantify and make usable a host of very complex data that will allow gardeners to actually implement the kind of insights that you're communicating. And that's a huge service to all of us. And so thanks so much. We have a number of questions in the chat, which I'll take first, and then anyone who wants to raise their hand and then unmute and ask a question can do that as well. The first question is, what do you think about cultivars compared to species? For example, in Akalea.
Yeah, I get this question at pretty much every talk I give here, so I was expecting that. Yeah, that's a great question, and my answer, I'm not going to say is the right answer. It's kind of opinion based, but I would say that if you have the option to not buy a cultivar, I would do that. And the reason being because some cultivars are bred for specific purposes. Some of them are bred to have different types of flowers that are more appealing to us visually, for example. And that breeding process can actually disrupt some of the natural cycles and natural traits of that plant. And some of those could be the traits that that plant uses to attract insects. Insects use the visual and scent cues in their environment to find the plants that they need. And if those cues have been disrupted through artificial selection to create these cultivars, it could interfere with their ability to use those native plant resources. Now, with that being said, I've seen Sorry, my dog's messing around in the background here. I have seen studies showing that some cultivars are totally fine. So if you are confident that you have a cultivar that is okay, and maybe you have, a study to support that, then I would say go ahead. But I've also seen some studies showing that some cultivars aren't providing the same value of resources for insects. So I think a lot of more work needs to be done in fully understanding that, and it's probably very species specific, but those are my thoughts.
And here's a question from Southern California. Emily says she lives in Southern California and has read recommendations not to plant within 10 miles of the coast, but your app says narrowleaf milkweed is a top priority plant in her area. So what guidelines would you give for planting milkweed near the Southern California coast?
Yeah, so I would say that that is definitely an error in my data. So now the reason that that showed up is probably because the way that this app works, using basically these large data sets and these shape files of geographic regions, is it actually could have registered because of occurrence that occurred 10 miles inland, but then it was piled in with the rest of the data for your area. So my recommendation would be definitely follow the official recommendations, which is not to plant within, I guess, I don't know, someone probably knows better than me, 5 or 10 miles of the coast. So I will go in and try to fix that. I need to find all the different areas where it's telling you to plant near the coast, because that is definitely an error. Thank you.
Monica has a question which is maybe more gardening than up your alley. She's planted yerba santa, and it's really invasive. And any suggestions to help with that? If anybody else has a suggestion, maybe they could put it in the chat to answer that. But Chris, do you have any thoughts on that?
All right, well, this is another great example of how I learned from giving these talks, because I did not know that yerba santa was considered invasive, maybe in certain areas. So yeah, I would say shoot me an email and tell me where it's showing up, where you think it should not be planted. A lot of our native plant species, even though they're native, either don't really do well in a gardening type setting because they become weedy, or they're just not really desirable species, period. So right now, I don't do anything to filter those out of this data set, but I am going to work on that. So yeah, I would say if you know that it's weedy or invasive, don't plant it. And also, please let me know so I can go fix that. Thank you.
Larry Bathgate says that he has moths on his oak tree, I assume agrifolia, coast live oak. And which moths are they likely to be?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question to answer, because oaks are one of those keystone species that are going to be supporting tons of species in California. So Doug Tallamy talks a lot about, he actually has a whole presentation about California oaks. So the short answer is I don't know, because it could be one of any hundreds of different moth or butterfly species.
And Stacy asks whether there's any research on white yarrow versus yellow or rose yarrow. you may have answered that with the cultivars, since I believe the more colorful ones tend to be cultivars or hybrids. Anything to add on that?
Nope, that's another thing that you probably know more than I do. I am only familiar with the white yarrow, but I didn't even know that there was yellow cultivars. So,
And Mary points out that Marin County has a bayside and also a coast side, an ocean side. And so how do you calculate we have the 5 mile limit? I believe we heard last month that it only applies to the ocean. It doesn't apply to the bay. Is that your understanding, Chris? That's for narrowleaf milkweed. You're muted.
I can answer that. Mia Monroe from the Xerces Society says the bayside doesn't count as the coast. The coast is what you're looking for. Worried about.
That's my understanding as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Clint says if you were to look at herbarium records, you would find some records of narrowleaf milkweed very near the coast in Southern California. Chris, did we lose you? We hopefully he'll be able to get back in. I think we've lost Chris, and what I'd suggest is just folks. Clint, you want to discuss that?
I haven't followed the recent distance that recommendations are for planting milkweed near the ocean coast. But if you were to look at herbarium records, and you can do that online, you would see some historic records of milkweed growing near the coast, and it's just a curious. It's curious, and I don't know that the people that are studying monarchs and making the recommendation not to plant near the coast have really addressed that. But so anyway, that's my current thought on that, and I haven't pursued it beyond that.
okay. Hi everyone. Sorry, my computer just totally froze on me, and I had to join on my phone. So sorry if I missed anything.
Oh, Clint was just talking about the understanding that some places in Southern California, narrowleaf milkweed grows very close to the coast, and if you had a comment on that.
Yeah, I've heard the same thing actually. I gave this talk to one of the Southern California chapters, and someone was telling me that they grow it near the coast and they see it growing in the wild too. So yeah, I'm not really sure. I'm curious to learn more about that though.
Julie says that she's noticed that the state list of invasive plants includes a lot of native plants and exotic plants that are unquestionably not invasive everywhere. Well, there are a variety of lists of invasive plants. I would just comment on that invasive plants, and some of them are designed for agricultural purposes. So one of the things you have to note is what's the purpose of the invasive plant list, and there can be native plants that could be invasive agriculturally that may not be invasive in the garden. Chris, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I would just say, like, I agree with what you said, and I've seen, a lot of examples of plants being listed, maybe not like by the word invasive, but as weedy species. Like, plants that may, just because they're native to California doesn't mean that they're desirable to have in like a landscaping setting or a gardening setting. So there are some native plant species, including ones that probably show up on my app, that maybe should not be planted in a garden. And that's something I could definitely use the help of plant experts, because I'm not I'm an ecologist. I'm not a plant expert per se, and helping to point those out.
Yeah, and Bonnie's suggesting plants like Yerba Santa, if you think they're invasive, going to be invasive, grow it in containers. And somebody's pointing out California poppies are invasive in cornfields, and yet we love them in the garden. Any further questions from participants? Feel free to unmute and ask. This is your opportunity. And I did put the URL for the butterfly net in the chat, so you can copy that and use it at your leisure. It's interesting to use. Well, if there are no further questions, we can call it a night.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I just didn't get a chance. Should I just say it out loud since I didn't have a chance to type it in the chat?
Yes, please do.
Okay. My question is there a place on the app that prioritizes which butterflies are of the most concern in terms of being endangered?
Yeah, great question. So right now, the way that you can see basically the endangered Lepidoptera is by looking for those highlights. So when you see the blue highlighted rows, that means that that plant is serving as a resource for a federally or state listed threatened or endangered species. Now with the monarch being listed, it added a whole lot of highlights because the monarch is a relatively common butterfly still. And uses a lot of different plant species. But keep in mind that in Marin County, to my knowledge, there's only 2 other officially threatened or endangered species, the Mission Blue and I think the Myrtle Skipper, if I'm remembering correctly. So there aren't too many, there's only 20 throughout the entire state that are officially threatened or endangered. But one thing that I'm working on right now with Matt Forrester at UNR, in conjunction with his research on butterflies, is to work more on that. Basically finding the butterflies whose populations are declining the most and integrating a way on the app for people to be able to focus on those butterflies.
Can you, when you use the app, rather than looking for the plants, can you search the butterfly and then find out what is good for that particular butterfly? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. As it is right now, you can't do that, but you're probably the 10th person who's asked for that feature, and it's something that I'm definitely working on. So look out for updates, and I'll have that when I get time from my dissertation to work more on the app. I'll add that in. Thank you.
But thank you so much for your work. I so appreciate it. It's amazing.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments.
And we have a couple more questions in the chat. Stephanie asked, would you consider Lepidoptera more important as a food chain link than bees' Hymenoptera?
Well, if I am on the Doug Tallamy train, I would say yes. Doug Tallamy is very famously outspoken about the disproportionate value of butterflies and moths. And so as far as like food chain link, I would say probably, and that's because of the data that we have, which is telling us that butterfly and moth caterpillars are the primary food source for a lot of #1 bird species, but it's not just birds, it's all different types of animals that in particular eat caterpillars. And caterpillars have a lot of things about their bodies, including the nutrient composition, that actually make them much better and much easier to eat than other groups of insects, including bees. Caterpillars are nice and squishy, and that means they're easily digested and easily eaten by a lot of different animals. So they really are, butterfly and moth caterpillars really are an integral food source across many different animal species and in most ecosystems. Now, bees, of course, are really, really important as well, because they're probably better pollinators than butterflies and moths, at least as far as we know with the data we have. So that's not to say that bees are not important, but they're all part of a healthy ecosystem.
Yeah. Jill asked about, what about anise swallowtails on anise? Am I correct that the anise swallowtail is one that has made the transition to invasive fennel?
I'm not sure about that particular species. I have a complementary data set to these native plant interactions, actually, from Jeffrey Caldwell. That is a full data set of how butterflies and moths in California are using introduced plant species. So I could check on that data set to see if the swallowtail is using fennel. But yeah, I mean, that's common, or I would say that as host plants, that's uncommon. There are a couple examples of native butterflies and moths transitioning to non-native host plants, but non-native plants can provide nectar resources. I would say definitely plant native if you can, but some introduced plant species, are especially controlled in a garden setting, can still provide nectar resources.
I'm not advocating planting invasive fennel. I mean, it's a weed. It's still,
Yeah, I would say not invasive fennel, probably. Yeah.
no. M. Sullivan says, regardless of which butterflies are declining more, we know that that we're facing an insect Armageddon, and birds are significantly in decline. So it's all of the above. And Jermaine says, one seeks hollyleaf cherry as being high on the list of important host plants, but I've not seen it in Marin. Should we be planning it to anticipate the climate change as a species movement? I think there's hollyleaf cherry either in Marin or very close to Marin. I don't think it's exclusively Southern California, even though it's not that common. Any thoughts?
I would need to look into its range map, but if I remember correctly, its range definitely does extend into Marin. I'm not sure how common it is, though, especially not being from there. So I would say, yeah, in instances like that, there's a lot to say about personal knowledge. Like, data sets can only go so far. But if you see a plant on that list that this does not grow in my area, then I would say use your best estimate of what to plant. And also, please report it as an error if you think it's an error.
I can add that it does grow in San Francisco, and I believe Sonoma County, I might be wrong there, but it skips Marin. So it's not indigenous to Marin. I don't personally see any harm in planting it in Marin. It's a very useful garden plant.
Yeah, I've got two of them in my garden, and they're very easy to care for, and they take pruning, and they're not terribly fast growing, but nothing seems to attack them. Yeah, Frederick says he's observed anise swallowtail thriving on fennel. Yeah, so.
Cool. You should, I would say, try to record that data somewhere, because that observational data like that, even from citizen scientists, is really, really valuable, even if it's an invasive plant species. So put it on iNaturalist, or you can send me the observation, because I can add it to the data set as well.
Great. Well, I think unless there are other questions from the group, we'll.
There's a question from Beverly Alexander, I see. on my screen. Beverly Alexander has her
Oh,
hand up.
It's strange.
Oh,
It's not
I
showing
did.
up.
I put my hand down and ended up typing in the chat because no one was paying attention. But what I was suggesting to everyone to just fool around with the app. It's so interesting. There's so much information there. And then if you click on a plant name, it'll take you to a Wikipedia entry about that plant. So you can just keep going on and finding more and more. And the house we live in was originally owned by Italian people. It was built in 1905. And so there was fennel growing all over the yard. And we did have swallowtails. So I think that they liked the fennel.
Yeah, thank you. That actually reminded me, I forgot to put this in the presentation. Excuse me. If you click on the names in the table, like Beverly said, it'll show you, number one, links to the Wikipedia articles, but it also will show you the list of butterflies and moths that use that plant as a host or nectar plant. So you can actually see the species. So that's, to answer a previous question, that's also one of the ways that you can try to look for the butterfly and the moth species, although you can't search for specific ones right now.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Chris. And before we close, I'd like to ask Chris and Jacob if you want to tell us about next month's program. Kristen, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. We're going to have a program on the fire, the Point Reyes fire. I'm blocking on the name of the
Woodward Fire.
Woodward fire. Thank you. And its aftermath. So look forward to that in March.
That should be very interesting. So we look forward to seeing you there the second Monday of March. So until then, have a good evening, good month. We'll hope to see you. Good night.
Good night. Thanks, everyone.